The mirror reflected a woman who should have felt content. The soft golden glow of my bedroom lights softened the lines of my collarbones, the curve of my shoulders. My black slip clung lightly to my body, delicate lace tracing over my skin. I ran a hand down my side, adjusting the thin strap, but something inside me hesitated. Everything in my life was perfectly structured, predictable, safe. My husband was a good man, reliable, focused, successful. He provided for us. We had a rhythm, a quiet understanding, a partnership built on mutual respect. And yet, I leaned closer to the mirror, tracing the outline of my lips with my fingertip. A familiar restlessness simmered just beneath my skin, an unspoken longing that I had learned to silence over the years. The sound of the doorbell snapped me out of my thoughts. Tonight my best friend was visiting with her son. He had been away for years, college, internships, some traveling. The last time I had seen him he was still a teenager, awkward in his own body, quiet in the presence of adults. But from what I had heard he had changed. I slipped into my silk robe and made my way downstairs, my bare feet soundless against the polished wooden floor. My husband had already answered the door, his deep voice mingling with the familiar laugh of my best friend. Then I saw him. I stopped for half a second just at the edge of the living room, before stepping forward as if nothing had changed. But something had. The boy I remembered was gone. The man standing in front of me was taller now, his shoulders broader, his face defined by sharp angles and confidence. His presence was effortless, his posture relaxed, but his gaze was anything but casual. "Wow," he said, his voice lower than I expected. "You look exactly the same." I let out a soft laugh, tilting my head. "And you look different." His lips curved slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I'll take that as a good thing." I reached out, offering my hand. A polite, distant greeting, just as it should be. But when he took it, his fingers curled around mine, firm, warm, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Something flickered in the space between us. Faint, unspoken. I withdrew my hand smoothly, as if I hadn't noticed. As if I hadn't felt the unexpected heat rise to my skin. We moved into the living room, the conversation easy, flowing. My husband and best friend spoke about work, politics, some upcoming event. I nodded along, sipped my wine, played the part of the engaged wife. But every now and then I would feel it again, his gaze on me. Not like before. Not with the casual admiration of someone who had known me since childhood. Oh, it was different. And I felt it in the way my breath caught just slightly when I looked up and found his eyes still on me. At one point his mother excused herself to take a phone call. My husband stood, stretching, then muttered something about another bottle of wine. Suddenly it was just the two of us. Silence settled between us, not awkward, not forced. Just there. He leaned back against the couch, his arms stretched lazily along the backrest, his fingers mere inches from my shoulder. "You haven't changed," he said again, this time softer. I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "I think time would argue with you." He tilted his head, studying me as if searching for something just beneath the surface. "No," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You still have that presence." Presence. It was such an unusual word, and yet it settled into my skin like a touch. I swallowed, willing my heartbeat to remain steady. "And you," I countered lightly, shifting my posture, crossing my legs slowly, "you've grown up?" His eyes darkened slightly, but before he could respond, footsteps signaled the return of my husband and best friend. The moment was gone. The night went on, laughter and stories filling the room. I played the role I had perfected over the years. The attentive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who had everything she ever wanted. But something had shifted. By the time they left, I found myself standing at the window watching them walk to the car. He reached for the door handle, paused. And then, as if he knew I was there, he turned his head slightly, just enough for our gazes to meet through the dim reflection of the glass. A silent acknowledgement. A whisper of something unspoken. And then he was gone. I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingertips against my lips. Something had begun. Whether I wanted to admit it or not. The next morning I woke up before my husband. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting soft golden streaks across the sheets. His breathing was steady beside me, the weight of his arm resting on my hip in a way that once made me feel secure. But this morning I felt nothing. I slipped out of bed carefully, careful not to wake him. In the bathroom, I studied my reflection in the mirror, fingers grazing my collarbone as I recalled the way his gaze had lingered last night. It was absurd. Inappropriate. And yet it was all I could think about. I turned on the shower, letting the hot water rush over me. My body was tense, my mind restless. The memories of last night played on a loop. His voice, his hand on mine, the way his eyes darkened when I crossed my legs. It was ridiculous. I was being ridiculous. And yet, the thrill of it made my stomach tighten. By the time I went downstairs, my husband was already at the table, drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup. There was a time when we would talk in the mornings. Lazy conversations over coffee, laughter about some silly dream one of us had. But now silence was easier. It wasn't uncomfortable, just expected. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message. Him. "It was nice seeing you last night." I stared at the words for a second longer than necessary before typing back. I almost left it at that. But then, as if my fingers had a mind of their own, I added, "You've changed." I shouldn't have. It was innocent, harmless. But I knew what I was doing. His response came almost instantly. "Him, and you haven't." "Not one bit." I set my phone down, my pulse unsteady. Later that afternoon I went to the gym more out of habit than necessity. It was the one place where my mind could shut off, where I could lose myself in repetition. Lift, stretch, push, breathe. But the moment I walked in, I felt him. I wasn't looking for him. Not really. But there he was. His back was to me, muscles tensed as he did pull-ups, the hem of his shirt lifting just enough to reveal a sliver of skin. He hadn't seen me yet. I could have turned around, left, pretended I never saw him. That I stayed. I walked to the treadmill, keeping my gaze forward, but I could feel the moment he noticed me. There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. A moment later he was beside me. "Didn't take you for a gym person," he said, his voice laced with amusement. I glanced at him, pretending to be unaffected. "And I didn't take you for someone who states the obvious." He grinned. "Fair enough." There was a beat of silence, thick with something I didn't want to name. Then casually he leaned in just slightly. "You look good." My breath hitched, but I didn't react. Instead, I turned the treadmill up a notch, pretending I didn't hear him. But I did. And he knew it. It was a dangerous game we were playing. And neither of us wanted to stop. By the time I got home, I felt like I had been holding my breath all day. My body was restless, my mind on edge. I should have told myself that it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But I wasn't. That night, when my husband kissed me before turning off the lights, I didn't feel anything. Nothing at all. But in the darkness, as I lay staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was someone else. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. The room was dark, silent, except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. My body felt heavy, but my mind refused to rest. I turned onto my side, staring at the empty space on the mattress. I should not have answered his message. I should not have let my mind wander back to the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his voice had dipped just slightly when he spoke to me. But I did. Morning arrived too soon. I went through the motions, shower, coffee, slipping into a fitted blouse and a pencil skirt. My husband barely looked up from his phone as I placed a piece of toast on his plate. "Busy day?" I asked, just for the sake of filling the silence. He nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Meetings. You?" I hesitated. "Nothing special." That was a lie. The city was alive, the streets buzzing with movement, but all I could focus on was the anticipation simmering beneath my skin. We hadn't planned to see each other. Not really. But I knew. And so did he. I entered the cafe, scanning the space before I saw him. Sitting near the window, coffee in hand, one arm resting lazily over the back of his chair. He saw me almost immediately, his lips curving in that unreadable way of his. "Is this a coincidence?" I asked as I slid into the seat across from him. He chuckled. "I'll let you decide that." I should have left right then. Walked away before the air between us became heavier, before the look in his eyes made my stomach tighten in a way it shouldn't. But I stayed. The conversation started out light. His work, his recent travels, the places he'd seen. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but the words barely registered. Because beneath the surface, beneath the polite exchanges and the occasional laughter, there was something else. Something neither of us was saying. "You look good," he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. I exhaled softly, lowering my gaze. You've already said that. And I meant it. Silence stretched between us. A beat too long. Then he reached for his coffee, and as he did, his fingers brushed against mine. Light. Brief. But enough. Enough to send a ripple of something dangerous through my body. I withdrew my hand quickly, wrapping it around my cup instead, but the damage was done. And he knew it. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, his head tilting slightly, studying me like a puzzle he was determined to solve. My breath felt uneven. The cafe was warm, too warm. I needed to leave. I should go, I murmured, pushing my chair back. He didn't stop me. But as I turned to leave, his voice reached me, low and deliberate. Do you want to? I hesitated. Then without answering, I walked out. I barely remembered the drive home. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my mind racing. What was I doing? This was absurd. And yet, as I pulled into the driveway, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My lips were slightly parted, my chest rising and falling faster than it should have been. I exhaled sharply. This had to stop. That night, as my husband kissed me, I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, I imagined someone else. But unlike before, I didn't feel guilty. I felt alive. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks over my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my fingers through my hair, trying to steady my thoughts. Last night had left a lingering hum beneath my skin, an undeniable shift in the way I carried myself. I told myself it was nothing. A moment of weakness. A slip that meant little. But deep down I knew the truth. Something had started. Something I wasn't sure I could stop. That afternoon my phone buzzed while I was putting away groceries. I need a favor. It was my best friend. A second later, another message popped up. Can you drive him to the retreat this weekend? It's just a couple of hours away and I can't get off work. I stopped breathing for half a second. I should have said no. I should have found an excuse. But instead my fingers moved before my brain could catch up. Me, of course. The drive was long, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of us, the city slowly fading into the distance. The car was filled with soft music, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. Neither of us had spoken much at first, the silence stretching between us, thick with something unspoken. Then finally he broke it. You haven't said a word in 30 minutes. I glanced at him, keeping my expression unreadable. Didn't realize I needed to entertain you. He chuckled. You're usually not this quiet. I focused on the road. I'm just driving. Pause. Then, are you? His voice was smooth, laced with something I couldn't quite place. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I'm not doing this, I muttered under my breath. Doing what? His tone was deceptively light, but I could feel the weight behind it. I exhaled sharply, finally turning to face him. Whatever this is, it stops now. For a moment he just looked at me as if weighing my words. Then slowly a small smirk touched his lips. You sure about that? The air inside the car felt suddenly too thick, too small. I swallowed hard, shifting in my seat. Yes. He leaned back, stretching his arms lazily. All right. But the way he said it told me he didn't believe me. And neither did I. We stopped at a roadside cafe halfway through the drive. A small, quiet place with dim lighting and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. I ordered tea. He got coffee. As we waited, he studied me. You know, he said, tapping his fingers idly against his cup, I used to have a crush on you. I froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. That's not exactly a revelation. He grinned. Yeah, but back then it was different. I raised an eyebrow. And now? His smile faded slightly. Now, I know you're not just some unattainable fantasy. My throat went dry. I forced a light laugh, shaking my head. You're ridiculous. And you're avoiding the truth. I set my cup down, my fingers tightening around the ceramic. Which is? He leaned in, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. That you feel it too. For a long moment I couldn't move. Then I stood up abruptly. We should get going. His eyes lingered on me for just a second too long before he nodded. As you wish. But the look he gave me said everything. We both knew it wasn't over. Not even close. The last stretch of the drive was silent. But this time it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, charged, like a wire pulled so tight it was one wrong move away from snapping. When we finally arrived at the retreat, I parked the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't get out. Instead he turned to me, studying my profile. "You keep telling yourself it's nothing," he said softly. I swallowed hard, staring straight ahead. "But we both know better." And then, without another word, he opened the door and stepped out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And the undeniable truth. I barely remembered the drive back home. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, yet my mind wasn't on it. It was on his voice, the way it curled around the edges of my thoughts, refusing to leave. "You keep telling yourself it's nothing, but we both know better." I gripped the steering wheel harder. This was a mistake. A mistake I should have never entertained. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for the faint glow coming from the living room. My husband was home. I took a deep breath, forcing my heartbeat to slow before stepping inside. He was sitting on the couch, the television playing quietly in the background. He glanced up when he saw me. "Hey," he said. "How was the drive?" "Fine," I replied too quickly. He nodded, turning his attention back to the screen. And just like that, the conversation was over. I should have been relieved. But I wasn't. Because for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel comfortable. It felt suffocating. The next few days were a blur of routine. Work, errands, dinner with my husband. I convinced myself that distance would fix everything. That time would dull whatever had ignited between us. I was wrong. Because when my phone buzzed 3 nights later, my breath caught in my throat. "I can't stop thinking about you." I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the message. Instead, my fingers hovered over the screen before I typed back. "You need to stop." The response came almost instantly. "Do you want me to?" My chest tightened. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. And then slowly I typed 2 words. I don't know." The gym was nearly empty when I arrived the next morning. I wasn't expecting to see him. At least that's what I told myself. But when I stepped inside and caught sight of him across the room, lifting weights with effortless precision, something inside me twisted. He noticed me immediately. Our eyes met through the mirror, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. I swallowed hard and turned toward the treadmill, forcing myself to focus. But then suddenly he was beside me. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, casual, as if this was normal. As if everything between us was normal. I glanced at him, keeping my expression neutral. "Morning." A beat of silence. Then, "Have you thought about it?" My stomach clenched. "Thought about what?" His lips curved slightly. "You know what?" I exhaled, shaking my head. "This is insane." "Is it?" I turned to face him, then really looking at him. His eyes were steady, unreadable. But beneath the surface there was something else. Something dangerous. Something I recognized. Because it was the same thing I felt. My fingers tightened on the treadmill handle. "This has to stop." He leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me you don't want it." My breath hitched. Because I couldn't. I should have left. I should have walked away. Instead, I found myself standing in the dimly lit hallway of the gym, my back pressed against the cool metal lockers, his body just inches from mine. We weren't touching. But we were close enough to feel the heat radiating between us. Close enough to know that if either of us moved even an inch, there would be no turning back. He raised a hand, brushing his fingers lightly against my wrist. A slow, deliberate touch. "Tell me to go," he murmured. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached for him. The moment our lips met, everything else faded. It was desperate, feverish, like we had been holding our breath for too long and were finally allowed to exhale. My hands curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. His fingers traced the curve of my spine, his touch burning through the thin fabric of my clothes. For a brief, fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences. Not the guilt. Not the fact that I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. Then suddenly reality crashed back in. I pulled away, my breathing ragged. "We can't do this." His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. "Then why does it feel like we already have?" I had no answer. Because he was right. The line had already been crossed. And there was no going back. Days passed, and with them came a haze of routine, the kind that might have once brought me comfort. I made breakfast, returned calls, kissed my husband before he left for work. On the surface, everything looked the same. But it wasn't. My thoughts were no longer mine. They belonged to him. The memory of his touch, the heat of his lips against mine. It was like a splinter buried just beneath my skin, impossible to ignore, impossible to remove. I told myself it would fade. That if I could just stay away, everything would return to normal. But that was a lie. I knew it. And so did he. We saw each other again by accident. If that's what I wanted to believe. I was running errands downtown, lost in a crowd of strangers, when suddenly there he was. His height made him stand out, his movements self-assured in a way that only made it harder to breathe. He smiled the moment he saw me, his steps quickening until he was close enough to speak. "Running away?" he asked, his tone teasing. I hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge him or keep walking. My feet betrayed me, planting firmly in place. "I wasn't expecting to see you," I said finally, my voice more even than I felt. "Neither was I," he replied, though the spark in his eyes suggested otherwise. The city noise swirled around us. Car horns, chatter, the steady rhythm of footfalls on concrete. But in that moment the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. "Have you thought about it?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "Thought about what?" "You know what," he said, the words soft, almost tender. I did know. I knew all too well. I glanced around as if someone might be watching, though we were just two figures on a busy street corner. The feeling of exposure made my pulse race. "Stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He tilted his head, his expression one of quiet amusement. "You don't mean that." The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. It was a week later when everything came crashing down. I should have stayed home. I should have made up an excuse, any excuse, to avoid seeing him again. But I didn't. I found myself at the same cafe where we had met before, sitting at a small table tucked into the corner. I arrived first, my heart pounding against my ribs as I stirred a spoon through my untouched tea. When he entered, it was like the air shifted. He slid into the seat across from me, his presence commanding, his gaze never leaving mine. "You came," he said simply. I didn't answer. His hand rested on the table, fingers lightly drumming against the wood. The movement was subtle, almost absent-minded, but it drew my attention. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my words barely audible over the hum of conversation around us. "Doing what?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "This," I said, motioning vaguely between us. "Whatever it is. It has to stop." He tilted his head, studying me. "Does it?" "Yes," I said firmly, though my voice cracked at the end. He leaned back, his gaze never wavering. "So stop it." It was a challenge, plain and simple. But I couldn't meet it. I couldn't tell him no. Instead, I dropped my gaze to the table, unable to hold his stare any longer. My fingers tightened around my teacup, the ceramic cool against my skin. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice softer now. I hesitated. And that was enough. When we stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting the world in shades of amber and gold. He walked beside me, close enough that our arms nearly brushed. Every step felt deliberate, every movement charged. "One last time," he said, his voice low, almost a plea. I should have said no. I should have turned and walked away. But instead I stopped, the words frozen on my lips. He moved closer, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the cool evening air. I didn't stop him. And when his lips met mine again, it was different. It wasn't a stolen moment in the gym or a fleeting kiss outside a cafe. It was something deeper, something that felt inevitable. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me against him, and I let myself be lost in it. Just for a moment. But moments don't last. And as I pulled away, my breath uneven, reality came crashing back. "This can't happen again," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. He didn't answer, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Please," I added, my voice breaking. Still he said nothing. And then finally he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. It was a lie. We both knew it. The days after our last meeting were slow and heavy. It wasn't guilt that weighed on me, at least not exactly. It was more a dull ache, a gnawing emptiness that came from knowing I had pushed him away. Life returned to its familiar patterns. I woke up early, brewed coffee, and exchanged brief words with my husband before we both left for work. I attended meetings, ran errands, prepared dinner. Everything felt distant, as though I was moving through the motions of someone else's life. Yet even in that routine I couldn't stop thinking about him. About what he'd said. About how he'd looked at me that last night, his eyes searching for something I wasn't ready to give. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the first crack appeared. My husband sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone while I tidied up the counters. The usual rhythm of our weekend. But then he spoke, his tone casual yet pointed. "I saw you talking to him the other day." I froze, my hand still gripping the dish towel. "Who?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. He glanced up, his gaze steady. "You know who I mean." I forced myself to meet his eyes even though my chest tightened. "He's just a family friend. You know that." "Do I?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Because it seems like he's around a lot lately." I struggled to maintain my composure, to keep my voice even. "I don't know what you're trying to say." "I'm not trying to say anything," he replied. "Just noticing." The weight of his words lingered long after he left the room. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I picked up my phone. I shouldn't have. I knew that. But the need to hear his voice, to see his name on the screen, was too strong. I stared at the blank message field, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. And then I typed, "Me, I can't do this anymore." His reply came quickly, as though he'd been waiting. "Neither can I." It was all the confirmation I needed. We met that night, not at the cafe or the gym, but in a quiet park on the edge of the city. The air was crisp, the moonlight casting long shadows over the empty paths. When I saw him standing beneath a tree, the tension in my chest finally released. "You shouldn't have come," I said, though I made no move to leave. "And yet here you are," he replied. I looked at him, really looked at him. The lines of his face, the way his hands rested in his pockets, the way his eyes never left mine. "I tried," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to forget about you." His expression softened, but he didn't step closer. "And did it work?" I shook my head. "No." Silence settled between us, heavy and charged. "I don't want to ruin your life," he said quietly. "But I can't stop wanting you." My heart ached at his words, at the vulnerability in his voice. "Then don't stop," I said. And just like that, the space between us disappeared. I don't know why I thought it would be easy to carry on. Each day felt heavier, the weight of our secret pressing harder on my chest. My husband's words that Sunday morning still rang in my ears. He wasn't trying to accuse me, not yet, but the seed of doubt was there. And every glance he gave me since then felt like a search for answers I wasn't ready to give. At work, my focus began to slip. The meetings dragged on without meaning. I found myself staring at the screen of my laptop, seeing his name floating in my thoughts instead of the numbers and graphs that should have mattered. My coworkers noticed. They asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed a break. I told them I was fine, but I knew I wasn't. And at home, the distance between us only grew. My husband tried to engage, suggesting dinner out or a weekend trip. I smiled, nodded, even went along with it. But each attempt at closeness felt like a bandage over a wound that refused to heal. I would watch him as he spoke, his familiar gestures, the way his face lit up when he talked about something that excited him. But instead of feeling warmth, I felt a strange hollowness. At night, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, haunted by the same question over and over. When did I stop being content with this life? When did the quiet routine of our days become unbearable? I thought about him constantly. The way he looked at me, the things he said. It wasn't just desire, though that was undeniable. It was something more dangerous. He made me feel seen. Not as someone's wife or someone's coworker or someone's friend. To see me. And that was something I hadn't realized I was missing. The next time we saw each other, it was because of a simple message. "And we need to talk." I knew I shouldn't respond. But I did. Me where? The park again. This time in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low and the shadows stretched long across the ground. It felt less secretive, meeting in the light of day, but no less risky. He was there before me, leaning against the same tree, his hands in his pockets. When he saw me, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "I can't keep doing this," he said before I even reached him. I stopped in my tracks. "What?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This, whatever it is. It's killing me." I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe. Fear. I didn't know. "I never meant for it to get this far," I said quietly. "I never meant for it to happen at all. And yet here we are," he replied, his voice heavy with frustration. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to make a choice," he said. Because I can't keep living in the in-between. I looked down at the ground, the dry leaves crunching under my shoes as I shifted my weight. It's not that simple. It is, he insisted, stepping closer. You just don't want it to be. His words stung, but I couldn't deny them. He was right. I was clinging to both worlds, afraid to let go of either. And in doing so I was destroying us both. But how could I make a choice? If I left, I'd lose everything. My husband, my home, the life we'd built together. And if I stayed, I'd lose the one person who made me feel alive again. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice breaking. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. Then figure it out, he said, his voice soft but firm. Because I can't keep waiting. I looked up at him, searching his face for answers I knew he couldn't give. And in that moment I realized something that terrified me. I wasn't afraid of losing my husband. I was afraid of losing him. The moment he walked away, I felt the cold rush of reality. He left me standing there in the fading afternoon light, his words hanging heavy in the air. He needed an answer, a choice. And I had none to give. When I got home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. My husband was in his office, the faint glow of his desk lamp spilling into the hallway. I stood in the doorway watching him work, the steady tap of his fingers on the keyboard an odd comfort. He glanced up briefly, offering me a small smile before turning back to his screen. In that moment I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it stole my breath. He didn't know. He didn't know the chaos I had brought into our life, the lies I had woven. And as I stood there, I realized just how much I had taken for granted. But the guilt didn't erase the longing. It didn't quiet the voice in my head that whispered his name. It didn't stop the ache that had settled deep inside me. That night I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangle of thoughts. I thought about him. His touch, his voice, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. And then I thought about my husband, the years we had spent together, the life we had built. How had it come to this? How had I let it all unravel so completely? When morning came, I felt no closer to an answer. At work I couldn't focus. I stared at my computer screen, the words blurring together. I excused myself from a meeting, pretending I needed to take an important call, but really I just needed to breathe. And then, before I could stop myself, I picked up my phone and typed a message. "Me, I need to see you." The response was immediate. "And where?" We met in the city at a quiet cafe tucked away on a side street. It was early evening, the sky streaked with deep purples and oranges. I arrived first, sitting at a corner table, my hands wrapped tightly around my coffee cup. When he walked in, my heart jumped. I hated how easily he affected me, how just seeing him could unravel my resolve. He sat across from me, his expression cautious, almost guarded. "I thought you were done with this," he said quietly. "I thought so too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. A long silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "I can't stop thinking about you," I admitted finally. "I can't. I don't know how to let go." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might get up and walk out. But then he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not going to be the one to break you," he said. "I won't push you to do something you'll regret." "But what if I already regret everything?" I asked, my voice breaking. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "Then figure out what you need," he said softly. "Because I can't keep waiting for you to decide." I drove home that night feeling hollow. My husband was already asleep when I got there, his even breathing filling the room. I slipped into bed beside him, my back to his, the distance between us feeling like a chasm. I knew what I had to do. I just didn't know if I had the strength to do it. The day started as usual. I moved through the motions of my life, preparing breakfast, answering emails, taking calls. Yet underneath it all, a decision loomed. It weighed heavily in my chest, a constant presence I could no longer ignore. My husband sat across the table, sipping his coffee and reading the morning news. I studied him, his familiar features, the lines that years of work and responsibility had carved into his face. I thought about everything he had given me: stability, trust, a life we built together. A life that, until recently, I had believed was enough. But now I knew the truth. It wasn't enough. I had agreed to meet him one last time. The park was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. When I saw him standing beneath the same tree, a sense of inevitability washed over me. I was drawn to him, pulled by something I couldn't name. You came, he said simply, his voice low. I don't know why, I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. What do you want? The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I knew it wasn't one I was ready to admit out loud. I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. His gaze didn't waver. You do. You just don't want to say it. Silence settled between us, thick and suffocating. I started, then stopped. The words felt heavy, dangerous. But he waited, patient, unyielding. I want to stop pretending, I said finally. Then stop, he said simply. That evening I sat in my car outside our home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The windows glowed softly, warm and inviting. Inside, my husband would be reading or watching television, waiting for me to join him. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremble in my hands. And then I walked inside. He looked up as I entered, smiling the way he always did. Hey, he said. You're home late. I stopped at the park, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? I hesitated, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. But this time I didn't falter. No, I said. It's not. The words hung in the air, shifting the space between us. His expression changed. Confusion, concern, something else. What's going on? He asked, standing now, his voice etched with worry. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt the ache of what I was about to do. But I couldn't keep pretending. What followed was not an argument, not a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, painful honesty. I told him about my feelings, the emptiness I couldn't ignore. I told him about the moments that had led me here, about the choices I had made and the lines I had crossed. He listened, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. When I finished, the silence was deafening. I don't know what to say, he finally said, his voice hollow. Neither do I admitted. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words settling over him. So, what now? I think we need time, I said, tears threatening to spill. Time to figure out who we are without this, without each other. He didn't respond, not immediately. Then with a heavy exhale he said, okay.